Yep, perfect. And Ijumaa picked our topic today. So I'm going to toss it over to you, Ijumaa. What is our topic, and what should we dive into together today? And hi, bud.
Welcome. I'm Ijumaa Jordan. This is Transformative Talk. And we're going to talk about supporting Black educators in this current time of social unrest, anti-racism. We're going to talk about how to create systems or begin to create systems that are anti-racist, that actually support Black educators and that are not performative, that we're just not talking about it. Like, to use the adage my grandma used to say, don't talk about it, be about it. So that's what we're going to dive into today.
Okay.
Sound good?
Sounds good. Do you want any agreements or any grounding before we begin, or just?
Yes, please. So the community agreement that I wanted us to come together on is around community, since we're looking at systems, and to understand that we don't do this work alone, that this work is, even though this might impact individuals, that we're working in community, and it's through community that we make change.
Beautiful. Okay. All right, Isela, do you want to build on that and or ground us?
I think that for this particular topic, it would be important for us to be mindful as to where our heart is. And so what I mean by that is, for me, the opposite of judgment is open-hearted. And there will probably be things that will be said as we engage in this conversation, because, it is a transformative talk, like that's the whole intent. And that when we start to recognize within us that we're moving into a reactive state, to kind of just focus in your heart space and just really intentionally open your heart. It's that idea of leaning into the discomfort and being comfortable with the discomfort that might be, that might come up for you as we engage.
And Isela, will you give what might be 3 reactive states? I'm going to guess maybe defensiveness might be one. Could you give us a couple other ones just to really be watching for it, especially those of us who are white?
I think defensiveness, but I think, what does that look like for you? So it's not just because defensiveness, I think we have these very generalized terms, even the idea of respect, it's like we have these very generalized terms, but what it feels for you, what does it sound like for you? So is it, nope, that's not me, or I've never experienced that.
Okay.
That's not true where I come from or what I grew up with. It could be a thought. It could be a physiological response. So it could be, the hair at the back of your neck. It could be your stomach clenching. It could be your hands, palms sweating, jaw tightening. A lot of us walk around with our jaws tight, and we don't even recognize that we're doing that. The process is to grow an awareness about you, how you respond to situations, and so keying into that is what's critical, I think, as we begin to, for me, it's like an onion, as we release these layers of bullshit. Sorry, guys.
Language warning.
But it's these layers that we have kind of protected ourselves with, these ideas, beliefs, and perspectives. And as we unlayer, we just have to become more and more aware of how we respond.
Okay. All right. So Ijumaa, let's come full circle then. So I do have my mindfulness t-shirt on, so that was good. We're going to come together in community as we do when we get our transformative talk, because we don't do this work alone. So set us up a little bit. What was on your heart or mind or both that led to this topic for today?
Honestly, I've been moving towards that feeling burnt out and not feeling hopeful in my work and in my personal life. And then I read this article that I sent to both of you. I'll link it in the group and I'll link it on my page. But I just wanted to read this part, a quote from the article. The author is a Black woman. She's been talking about the importance of self-care through these times. And then she writes, yet self-care is necessary and recommended. It is not enough. We can set all the boundaries in the world, take all the exercise classes, sleep all the hours, eat all the right food, see the best therapist, and still be unwell. Why? Because many of us work in school systems and environments that undo all our good self-work with performative anti-racism, racism, toxicity, thank you, and hostility.
Wow.
Yay for me for reading in public.
You and me both. You and me both. Right? I that's one of my least favorite things. So I appreciate your bravery and your persistence on it. As she finished that in the quote, and I put the chat in the chat, Ijumaa, I put the link to the article, and she said, "But we are exhausted." And I feel like when you said burnt out, what I felt from you was exhaustion.
Mm-hmm.
Not just burnt out, because burnout is almost like when we talk about a militia versus domestic terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of softens it in some way or justifies it or allows it, or it's perfectly normal that we go through burnout. But to allow another human to be exhausted because we're unwilling to do things differently, I don't know, it feels different for me.
I hear that. Yeah, like I use it because that's the language that we usually use. And when I think about burnout, like I know, like when I do this work in anti-racist work, that I'm walking through fire, but I can only take so much. Yeah. And so when I get to that space that, you know what, I've been resting, I've been eating a good food, I've been talking to a therapist, and I'm still unwell. And so I know if I'm feeling that, and I have a lot of great support and I have a lot of great community, that I know that other Black women and Black educators are feeling this way. Because
so let's talk about that then. Because I'm not sure that everyone has an understanding of what that looks like. I mean, I get the unwell piece, yes, but when, because I think at some level we've all felt at some point where we just feel overwhelmed or we're burning our candle at both ends. But as a Black educator, walking into schools, programs, serving children and families, what are the things that you believe, Ijumaa, affect, and I'm going to just say, your soul? Mm-hmm. As you walk in and you experience that, what are the things that happen on a day-to-day that make it difficult?
I think one is that even though that some schools and some programs and some organizations are like, oh yes, we can be anti-racist, but they're not willing to give up or share any power.
Yeah.
And so I have to sit while they cry, like, all these bad things are happening. And so I'm like, so let's talk about how you're using power right now. How like this anti-racism, this racism thing isn't just happening out there; it's happening in here. Mm-hmm. The call is coming from in the house. And so so what makes me tired is the denial of that and how much space and how much energy has to be put in. Just me as a professional, and I know that educators are getting that from their colleagues, because the other thing, and one of the rules that I have when I work with mixed race groups and multiracial and multicultural groups is that you can't go back and ask your Black coworker or your Black or your person of color coworker about what I just said. If you have a question about it, come back to me and talk to me about it, because I have the capacity, basically because I'm being paid. Like they don't need that extra emotional labor. So that part of it is that emotional labor piece, that not only do you have to deal with racism outside, but you have to deal with it inside. And in early education, especially in early education, it's been my experience that there's some deep denial about the racist systems and the racist practices that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. Across the board, I think even as we move into, especially as we move into the elementary schools, it's like the unwillingness to open your eyes and to take responsibility. I
Mm-hmm.
think recognize my part in that. And yeah, I become really frustrated with that.
Well,
It's like some people are even unwilling to speak the words racist
Yes.
practice.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Like, that doesn't exist if I don't say it.
I feel like what we need to do is sort of name some things, like, but at the same moment, it helped me because I feel like I'm going to put an emotional labor on this request. So I'm like, I want to do this, but I'm like, oh, now I'm asking you to do the heavy lifting. I just want to be really clear for folks. When we say it's right there in your own house, like for microaggressions, which people may not even know what that term means, which of course transcends race, because it could be a microaggression on gender or ability or any of our identities, but we're talking right now. And unfortunately for Black educators, there's already going to be sexism and racism just out of the gate, and classism because of the other two. What would be some things that are happening right in the same house that, let's say, a person in power needs to start taking ownership over and stopping? What are some things that we might be seeing repeatedly that we just don't see, white people don't see, because we've just allowed the denial or we've allowed our comfort?
I think about sometimes of our attendance policies or how we bring on board and bring and recruit families in. And sometimes it's an intersection of race and class. So even though it might be a high quality program and they might have money to give scholarships, so sometimes they just assume because this is a Black family, like they need a scholarship, or they bring them in and still treat them in a classist way. Like they still make assumptions of, oh, you got in here because like affirmative action. Like I just had a client that one white mother said to a Black mother, like, oh, this is a really prestigious school. I didn't know they had an affirmative action program. And so she's looking around like, what are you talking about?
Oh, wow.
So it's like those, like that's a microaggression.
Absolutely.
And so I asked the director, so what did you do? She was like, I just called you.
That's what I would do.
And so not knowing, I think people know like not to just react and not to shame and blame, but then they're like, well, then how do I address it if I don't take that path? And so part of our responsibility as people in leadership is to have some responses, to know, first of all, not to deny it, like know that those things happen, and do your best to protect families from doing that and protect your staff. And so talking about the biases, the implicit bias when they become conscious and you say it out loud. So what's going to be our response?
So that's helpful. I just want to pause it there, and then Isla, you can build on it. When I was thinking about today, I was thinking, okay, we want to limit and prevent these microaggressions, these things that we don't intend. Like I know, like Ijumaa and I have been talking about all these words that have the word white in them. And so just becoming aware of whiteboard and blackboard. And the other day I was like, okay, what's a synonym for a whiteboard? But it's like, it's on me to like notice that those words have meaning and words have power. And I can't be in denial that, well, we've just always called it a whiteboard or a blackboard. That can't possibly hurt anybody's feelings. So I was thinking about that in terms of like, okay, limit and prevent, which what I like what you said there, Ijim, was that by not being in denial, that's how we can actually limit and prevent. Because otherwise it could feel like, well, what am I watching for? But if we've got to remove the denial and then we have to repair. So, Isela, I just wanted to kind of say that. But what were your thoughts as she said that?
I think, and this goes back to that open-hearted thing that I was talking about, is the awareness. It's really paying attention. And the awareness of the language that we use. See, I'm a real big stickler about, we can make generalized statements, but what does it really sound like in practice? So what I mean by that, when somebody says something that is a microaggression, what's the language that we agree to use here? That is going to, and I think that when I was a director, one of the conversations that we had pretty frequently, and I even have a list of adult scripts of the language, like, help me understand your perspective. My perspective is a little bit different than yours. What was just said right there, let's really talk about that, and let's really go deeper into how that could be affecting others. It's like that kind of language. I think that as a community that we can have an agreement that we are all need to be open-hearted, because the awareness, sometimes we just have said things for so long. I know in my family, I listen to the way my family talk, I'm like, what is going is anyone, hello, it's one of those things that when you become aware,
you're like, oh
my goodness, right? But how, because you and I have engaged in this kind of banter or playful, quote, playfulness, sometimes it's uncomfortable for me now to address it because of the relationship we have. So how are we going to agree to have these difficult conversations? And how do we walk away from this okay? Because unfortunately, and, I've worked in a lot of agencies and organizations where folks like to hold on to stuff from 2008.
From the 80s.
I know, right?
Stuff from the 80s.
That one time
you took my marker from the board.
Like,
and I ordered that.
Yes, we have to be willing to like, Brene Brown talks about rumbling, to have that, rumble, and to be okay. Like, how do we get to the place where you and I can sit next to one another and still have this respect and honor one another as a part of our community?
And what I really appreciate what you said there, Isela, was it's still like, you're not in denial, you're going to take it on, but you're still holding on to some agreements. We're not going to blame and shame. So I'm not going to be like, hey, pull you aside and say all these things you said wrong, but we're not going to just sweep it under the steps either. So then, Ijumaa, go on with your story. So she calls you and she's like, 911, Ijumaa, how do you help these leaders? What do you say? Do you give them scripts like what Isela was saying?
Sometimes I've given scripts. And the first thing I always want to do is like move into stopping the harm and moving into repair. And so I was like, okay, great, you called me. But right now, I want you to hang up and call that parent that was harmed, and tell them that you heard this and that you're sorry. Like, you can't apologize on behalf of the parent, but you can say, like, I heard about this and I'm very concerned, so I'm calling to check in on you and see how you are. And so she did that. The parent was extremely gracious. Extremely gracious. That's
why she's going to be exhausted.
Right? And was like, it was no big deal. Like, I forgot about it and just went on with my day. But like, that was messed up what she said. And so she asked, and I also told her to ask her, what could help making amends. And she was like, well, I don't want to like have to go back and forth with like this parent. I see her every morning. I don't want it to be awkward. But I think that like in our next parent meeting, if we could talk about microaggression and implicit bias and how to talk to, and like what, like those words and like what scripts should we do to engage people? Like, cause she shouldn't just make an assumption about like affirmative action. Like, what is that even about? Like, I'm here because like this is a good school and I pay good money for my kid to be here.
Right. Right.
So they did, and then the white parent prompt went and apologized, and so like they're cool now.
Right.
But it was because of the graciousness of the Black parent that it didn't like just tear the school down. Like she was gracious, and I think what else I told her, because the director that I was working with, she likes to give gifts and like rewards to her educators. So I was like, maybe you should like give her a little gift and thank her for being gracious and talking to you. Because I think the director like makes homemade soaps or something. So she made her some homemade soaps and gave it to her. And so like the parent came back and was like, oh, that was so nice of you. And, and thank you for doing that. So no one felt like put on the spot or the light was shined on them and like, oh, we have this huge racial problem. Like nobody was running around saying that. Is that it was handled in the way that the person that was harmed wanted it handled. And they had some restoration of relationship with the school and between the parents.
And if we extrapolate like from that story, let's kind of go all the way back to how you were talking in the very beginning about why this topic, these kind of microaggressions are happening every day to our Black educators, and there isn't anyone that's systematically doing that repair.
Right.
And or they think, so I'm going to just say that the leaders probably white, just statistically, they think that they might be doing something good by asking the Black educators to take a lead in anti-racist work.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's that emotional labor or that burden. And that doesn't mean just Black educators. It could certainly be it could be anyone from one of those identities. But for today, we really want to think about where are we perpetuating microaggressions, being in denial, or creating more strain and stressors on our Black educators.
Mm-hmm. And so if you're a director, a principal, or anyone in leadership, and you're just thinking like, oh, I'm going to go to this Black educator and ask them to do anti-racist work. If they weren't doing it before, then that probably shouldn't be the person that you ask. If they have been speaking up and they might be interested, then you need to make sure that you go to them because you have a budget and there's time that you can give them to prepare to do this with
support.
With support. So if you don't have that yet, then don't do it.
Okay.
Or if there isn't anyone, because a lot of educators like, I just want to show up and do my work. Like I don't want to do anything extra. Mm-hmm. So then that means you hire somebody from the outside. But just don't assume that your Black staff and your Black educators want to do this work or be on the committee, because everybody doesn't have time. So if you're going to have a committee, then just invite everyone and see who shows up.
Okay. I was also thinking about, I don't want to shift gears, Isel, if you wanted to jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to talk about professional development for a minute.
No, go ahead.
So many of you that might be listening know that I've been thinking a lot about where my professional development needs to be systematically thought through in terms of where am I upholding the white dominant culture, where am I doing microaggressions and so forth. So that's my personal journey, but I want us to really think about so much of, even right now, I've heard from so many administrators, can you come and do PD? But my staff is really burnt out. Their cognitive threshold is limited. They really need self-care built into the PD. While you're talking about math and social emotional health and well-being, we also do some stuff about how to care for the caregiver, okay? So there's awareness that our teachers across the board need more support. However, my feeling is that in so much of the PD that we're offering, we're actually depleting our Black educators, once again, because of the microaggressions or the denial or the lack of awareness of whatever we chose to do as PD, is actually in opposition of restoring, repairing, healing.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted you guys to talk a little bit about that as well.
Did you want to go, Isela?
No, you go ahead.
So I'm thinking about some recent things that have happened, and some choices I've made as professional development provider. I was working with a group and we were talking about race, and one of the white educators shared a story, and she used some racist language. And she was just sharing, like, it wasn't her intent to make anybody feel bad. And she wasn't actually aware that just using a word or describing that word would be harmful, and people would feel they might be upset about it. And so I brought that just in general, bringing that to people's attention about being careful about the words that we use, especially in contexts where there is a multiracial group, to be more aware of that. And then I made the choice of separating and having caucuses. So we all learned about, like, an article, and we all talked about that. But then I moved people into racial caucus groups so that there would be a safer space and there would be less microaggression being experienced by the Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I know, like, that can be a shock. Like, it was kind of a shock for the group, and it can be a shock, like why would you do that, right? That's segregation.
Right?
And, like, no, because the reason why you think that's segregation is because you have a false belief that proximity is what takes care of racism, that what ends racism. So just being near a Black person or Indigenous person or a person of color does not do anything for racism, right? You just have a friend. It does nothing for systemic racism. That is actually the work that we do together is what takes down the system. And so just because you have a Black friend, a Black boyfriend, a Black partner, a Black cousin, just because you have proximity to them doesn't mean that that you don't do racist things, or that the systemic racism is being dismantled.
And the opposite is true too of what you just said. Because you did these caucuses, by doing the separation, we weren't being racist. You were actually trying to protect in that group. It could have been not just Blacks, but there could have been all kinds of people of color. That you were reducing the microaggressions to take care of a particular topic, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yes. So one of our roles as leaders and as professional development provider is to think about protection, knowing that being in mixed racial groups, that there's a higher incident of racial microaggression.
Yeah.
You were going to say something, Isela?
Well, I attended one of your sessions where we were separated out, and I'm just wondering, in the white section that you had, were there questions and conversations about why you chose to do that? Like, what was the questions around that?
So I'm trying to remember which one, but sometimes there's questions, and sometimes it depends on the audience. Some people are used to that. Like, if you've done anti-racist work, then you might have some experience with that, but that is a general question. Sometimes, like, I say it up front, and sometimes I just do it just so we have practice and a lived experience of doing that. And so pushing back on this idea of proximity and working through that is that. And so sometimes people don't have questions until, like, after they have that experience, and then they're like, "Oh, why do we have to be separate?" Sometimes I do get that, and then most of the time people just kind of go along with it, and then they're like, "Oh, I could see why this might be helpful.
Yeah, I want to ask a couple of practical questions, and Isela, maybe you can talk about how it felt as a participant or how you would do it as well. So Ijumaa, if I heard you right, sometimes you prepare your participants that you might do this, and other times you might just be like in the moment, Zoom breakout rooms. And how do you let people select out and say, if you are a Black, Indigenous person of color, stay here. If you're white, go there. And you just
yeah.
Okay.
I don't police anybody's racial identity.
Yeah. You don't set it up more than that. You're just like, go. And then do you have facilitators in both of those? So like, let's say I'm doing TV and I want to use this strategy.
Yeah.
Do I need let's say it's all Black educators, would I need a Black facilitator to reduce
sometimes it just depends on who I have available. So sometimes it works out that I have a racial match in the facilitation groups, and sometimes I don't, because it just depends on who we have available. And sometimes I just have white facilitators because to let them have the practice of holding that space, because then they get to practice not being the talker and not being a leader, because they just have to be the facilitator. They're there to listen and facilitate the conversation. So they're not there to teach, and that can be a good practice for them. And usually, on the rare occasion that I do just have white facilitators, the people of color and the black people and Indigenous people step up and like, okay, here's what we're going to talk about, and they just get to be a part of it in a different way. So I almost always have facilitators. Sometimes I don't. But I do try to have facilitators, and I talk to facilitators through that.
And so let's say I'm co-teaching with my friend Julie, who's also white, because we just do a lot of that, and we don't have anyone else but the two of us. In that instance, I could let the group facilitate themselves, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And if a white person is the facilitator, it's literally to make sure people can get in the Zoom room, back out, and know what time to stop, but not to control the conversation. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and so sometimes, and I also remind and sometimes you might be asked to leave. And if you're asked to leave, then just go.
Okay. And be open-hearted about it, right, Isela?
Yes.
So Isela, what was your experience with that, either as a participant or have you done this as well?
I have never done it, not as a presenter or a trainer. I found it really, it makes total sense to me, but I have to say I wondered about because it's the white folks who struggle with it.
Right.
And so I wondered what that conversation was like about that perspective of this being said, that you're really perpetuating the racist to mind. I don't know how many times I've had this conversation. My child is biracial. So I have a little girl who is half Black and half Mexican. And when she was younger, one of the things that would happen quite a bit, actually, is people would want to touch her hair. And a conversation that happened so many times with colleagues of mine was that when it was older white people who wanted to touch her hair or would say something like, oh, she looks just like my grandbaby. Let me show you a picture. They don't look nothing alike. Not a thing except the fact that they're both biracial, right? And so I would get really upset. And my daughter didn't like anyone to touch her hair. She doesn't, and I taught her the language for that. She would say to them, no, thank you, or no, I don't like anyone touching my hair. And I wanted her to have the courage to say that. But the issue was, whenever it was white, older women, my colleagues would make excuses for that, would say, oh, but she's older. Oh, and when I said grandmother, everyone assumed that she was also 75 years old. You know, I'm old enough to be a grandmother. So, you know, it's like these ideas of, oh, that poor older lady just doesn't know better, so it makes it okay, or that I need to give her a pass. And so it made me think about the times that I've had, again, conversations with colleagues about that. And I remember just feeling so frustrated about why does that make it okay? You know, why should I sit back and pretend like that's an okay thing for her to do or for them to do?
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
go ahead, Ijumaa.
Go ahead, Christy. So like that dismissal and that other false belief that racism happened in the past, right? It's just older people that hold racist beliefs, right? Like being old is synonymous with being racist, which isn't true, right? Like we're not just waiting like for the old racist people to die, right? Because they've been dying and we still have racism.
Yeah, there is one I know you die. There is one.
But to know that racism isn't just something anomaly, right? Racism is baked into our system, it's baked into our lives, and that everyone is experiencing it on some level, right? And so that the hair touching and the belief that white people have ownership over Black bodies, especially in the United States, that's actually what that's based in, that practice is based in. And it's not just older white women. I was in Michael's one time in the arts and crafts store, and I was standing next to a Black woman, her Black daughter, and we both had like Afro puffs, like both of our hairs were puffy, and this white woman leaned over me and was about to touch the little girl.
Mm-hmm.
I turned her and I looked at her and I was like, what? And the mom was like trying to move the baby away. And then the woman got like flustered and upset, was like, oh, she's just so pretty. I was like, she is, but you don't touch her.
Yeah. That happens a lot. And I have to tell you, it happens in early childhood programs all the time. All the time. And I'm telling you, that when it's an older person, and that's just been my personal experience. Mm-hmm. Oh, she doesn't know better. Oh, right. It's like it's a free pass somehow.
Nope, but there's no free passes. Like, stop touching Black babies.
Right.
don't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So there's so many things I want to say about that, but I'm just gonna.
But it does go back to that is something that happens in early childhood programs, that it happens to biracial children.
Mexican little girls too, because they're
a lot of little girls because they're so pretty, and I just want to touch them and touch their hair and touch their bodies. And that there's another place, like we're tired, right? Because we have to help children have this language of telling people not to touch them. And and it feels like sometimes like, oh, like that's disrespectful, because that might be the pushback. Like, oh, that's just so disrespectful for you not to let your elders, touch you or do something to you. And no, like in our school, in our program, like we ask before we touch,
right?
Before we touch materials, before we touch people's bodies, and we touch them in the way that they want to be touched. If they don't want to be touched, we don't touch them. If they want to be touched, they want to hold your hand, they want to touch your hair. Like, you get to choose how you're touched, and that's for everyone. And so for the adults, like, you have to know that that you may be holding that racist belief that you should have access to Black bodies. And so that's a conversation as adults that we need to have, and not dismiss it because you're an older white woman, or proximity because you have a biracial grandbaby. Like, none of those free passes, none of those excuses.
Well, I'm gonna stretch it even further. Just because you're a special ed teacher doesn't mean you can move children around.
Yes.
Because nothing gets me fired up more than for a child who has already limited mobility and fewer ways to communicate their wants and needs and preferences to be all in, bodies on them all the time, moving them through space,
right?
Disregarding any communication that they say. Like, the story I give all the time was this little kid, he used his eyes to communicate. So it was an eye gaze to a device. And he kept saying, I don't feel well. And I swear, I've told you guys probably the story 100 times because it drives me crazy every time. someone would walk by and they would touch his head and go, "Oh, you're fine." And then he'd look at the thing and says, "I don't feel well." And somebody would go, "Oh, you're fine." And then like 8 times the kid would look at the thing and says, "I don't feel well." And somebody in some way would either touch him or just dismiss him and tell him that's not how he felt. And I'm like, oh, for the love of God, do you know how much effort it took for that little kid to make this comment with his eyes? And we're just going to be like, so I know that's not the topic, but for me, it just goes on and on in different formats about how we move people's bodies in space and don't respect their bodies, even babies.
Oh, big time.
Talking to babies about what you're going to do before you do it. Yeah. Okay. Whew. So let's do this, girls, because that one, yeah. Because it's so hard when you're little, and it's just even harder when you're marginalized for other reasons. I understand. Yeah. So one of the things I want to think as we kind of bring this to closure, I want to go all the way back to what you said in the beginning, Ijumaa, about you yourself feeling burnt out. And I use the word exhausted on your behalf. But I get a little exhausted just thinking about all the microaggressions, from the name of the curriculum to the type of clip art that people use, to the slogans on the walls, to the committee formula, to the PD. Like, there's so many ways we're doing it. So what are some takeaways that folks can do to remove some of these microaggressions and or aggressions? Let's not just pretend they're small. What can we do? What can we do for our Black educators to limit, to prevent, to repair?
So I would say, like, being honest, right? And so instead of moving to defensiveness and denial, that we move into honesty. And so maybe you can't see, like, I don't understand how that was racist, but you can be honest about, I'm feeling really uncomfortable and I might need some time to process that. Like, I hear you and I'm feeling very uncomfortable, and I need to find some support to figure this out. Because I feel myself being defensive. I feel myself about to say, no, that can't be true. And so being honest about your feelings and being able to talk about that, and being honest about that racism is happening in early childhood programs in micro ways and interpersonal ways and systemic. Yeah. Because the system is supporting those microaggressions. Anytime someone denies or makes excuses, that's the system upholding that interpersonal. Because especially as leaders, right? Because if you're just dismissing, if someone's coming to you and saying this person did this racist thing, and you're like, oh, not Susie, she's so nice, and she has a Black husband.
Or she's older.
Or she's older. Or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And she didn't mean it, right? Talk about her intention. Well, I'm sure she didn't mean it that way, right? As leaders, we have to be honest that that's what we are doing, and that we're using our institutional power to uphold those microaggressions.
Okay. Got it.
I could go on, but go ahead, Isela.
I think for me, I used to have this sign. It's a quote, pretty famous now. It says it's something like, say what needs to be said, even if your voice shakes. Mm-hmm. And it was something that as a leader, I really had to remind myself every day that when you're an administrator, when you're a leader of a program, when you oversee, a group, that you have to step into that courageously. And that means the willingness to not only look within, but to also hold folks accountable. That we have to be willing to say what needs to be said. The key is to learn how to say it in a way that doesn't shut people down, but rather create opportunities or invitations to really be self-reflective and to really move in the direction. And that the expectation is that we are going to keep moving into this anti-racist work. That if you are not willing to do this work, then this isn't the program or the agency for you.
Or the educational field.
the
Right?
education field. That's
You
right.
need to rethink your job.
Right. And so it's like, but as a leader, sometimes I think so often as a director or principal, people are hanging on because to every single, person who can breathe walking in through the door, because it's so hard to find good personnel. And so sometimes we don't say what needs to be said.
Right.
Well, as a leader, you have to step courageously into that position and that role and let everyone know that this is going to be the expectation.
Right? You even mentioning race, that you even mentioning racism. So some people are going to be shut down, but you can't let, like you say, like you can't let that stop, right? We're still going to do the work. So what support do you need to then come back again? So maybe not right now, but maybe in 5 minutes. Maybe tomorrow we can continue to talk about it. But as a community, we're going to always move forward, right? And we want to be a supportive community, but we're not going to stop. Because what usually happens institutionally, that if a white person gets upset, like a white person cries in the meeting about anti-racism, and like, oh, we shouldn't do this work anymore.
Right.
And so you have to so it's not, people might shut down. Like that is a possibility to happen. And that's just a reaction of being defensive. But we can support people through that, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the end all. It's not going to end our discussion and our work. Mm-hmm. And so being aware of that and not taking it personally, because directors will feel, well, people are very upset. Like, yeah, racism is upsetting. Right. But just not hearing about it is upsetting. And it's not worse than experiencing racism.
Right.
Because when you let people cry and get defensive and shut down, and then you stop, what you're saying is that, well, that's worse than actually experiencing racism.
Right.
And so if we're really about supporting Black educators, then we have to keep moving. We have to keep committing to this work, even when, and it's never the whole group of teachers. It's never the whole administrative team. Like it's maybe one or two people. Like we can handle that, right? Because we're professionals. But we can't let it stop, because we can't prioritize that above doing our anti-racist work.
Right.
I think that's the note we'll end on, that it's not, that discomfort or that being uncomfortable or somebody's feelings or whatever, to ever imagine that that's worse than experiencing racism cannot be the comparison. I guess I want to also, on this ending note, is if folks were intrigued by some of our conversations about how, Isela talked about how she gave scripts and helped people work through that repair, or how Ijumaa was the 911 for someone, or how they experienced professional development. Ijumaa, I want to tell them a little bit about your offering in 2021, and I put the link where we're really going to work systematically to look at how professional development is upholding the white dominant culture, and on that note, sort of allowing other comforts above or equal to experiencing racism. And so I would invite anyone, even if you're not a PD provider, I'm really feeling like if you're a leader of a program and you're holding staff meetings, or you're making decisions that are about your culture within your school or your program, just like the stories that Isela shared, this is a series where I think is a really good match. Would you agree, Ijumaa? I
would agree on that.
Because, go ahead, say what you're thinking.
So if you're working with other adults,
right? Exactly,
this can be a place for you. This is an offering that you can find value in.
Yeah. So we can walk through some of those examples about, and that's what I appreciate about working with you both, is that I can ask and I don't want to say dumb white question in a way that is like, oh, it's not dumb. It is dumb. And it is embarrassing that I don't know the answer, but I don't want it to be about centering me, because that would be like, oh, me being embarrassed that I don't know the answer is worse than experiencing racism. So all I want to do is express gratitude that I have this community in the two of you to be able to ask these questions and get better and limit and repair when I need to. And that's what I want to create for other folks, is a place for them to be able to do the work in a way that will lead to differences in both their intrapersonal interactions and the systemic. So that's a long way to say I'm grateful for you both.
Yay!
Any last comments before we tune out? We're good?
Yeah, I think
I'm
we're good.
good. Thank you.
Thank
That
you,
was a
everyone.
very lively conversation.
I can only imagine what episode number 24 might look like. All right, thank you both.
Thank